In the harsh winter of 1856, twin sisters Mercy and Temperance Blackwood hid terrible secrets deep in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri. For more than 10 years, their remote Devil's Den Hollow cabin lured traveling men into a horrifying web of ritualistic sexual coercion, which they claimed were sacred. Silas, Declan Murphy's father, wouldn't stay quiet when his son went missing. What the sheriff found under their house showed that they had been living in a terrifying reign of terror. Why did the people in the area protect them? What dark faith drove them to commit crimes? This is the scary story of the Blackwood sisters and the man who stopped them. Devil's Den Hollow was one of the most remote and scary places in the Missouri Ozarks during the harsh winter of 1854. It was a natural basin carved out of limestone and surrounded by tall bluffs that looked like ancient fortifications against the sky. The hollow was 40 miles northeast of Springfield and could only be reached by dangerous mountain paths that were completely blocked off during the harsh winter storms that hit the area all the time. Snow could keep people stuck for months at a time, making them feel like they lived on a faraway island. Cedar Ridge, the closest town, was 12 miles away. The terrain was so dangerous that even experienced mountain men wouldn't go there alone during bad weather. Mercy and Temperance Blackwood came to this harsh place in the fall of 1843, saying they were the only survivors of a Kentucky family that cholera had killed. The twin sisters, who were 21 at the time, came to Cedar Ridge with a single mule carrying strange bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. Even though they were wearing old clothes and had rough hands from traveling, they spoke in the careful way that educated women do. They told anyone who asked that their grandmother had taught them how to heal before dying from the same disease that killed their parents. All they had was knowledge of herbs and a strong desire to find a place where they could practice their skills in peace. In 1843, the mountain towns of the Missouri Ozarks were in dire need of any kind of medical help. There weren't many formal doctors, and they were often hundreds of miles away in bigger towns. Giving birth often meant death for both the mother and the child, in a place where help could take weeks to get there. When the Blackwood sisters showed off their skills in herbal medicine and midwifery, they were met with the kind of gratitude that people show to those who can save lives in medical emergencies. The twins decided to live in an empty trapper's cabin deep in Devil's Den Hollow. The cabin had been empty for 3 years because the last person who lived there had disappeared in a way that the locals didn't want to talk about. The sisters said that the cabin's seclusion was perfect for them because they needed to be able to concentrate on their work in peace and have access to the wild herbs that grew in the hollow's protected area. They spent their first winter strengthening the building and planting gardens for medicinal plants. They only left when families called them to help with medical emergencies. Mercy was the more practical of the twins. She delivered babies and treated injuries in a way that made desperate families trust her. She knew more about herbal remedies and surgical techniques than the folk remedies that mountain families had passed down for generations. People who were used to seeing loved ones die from treatable illnesses thought her methods were almost magical. She could stop bleeding, lower fevers, and make difficult births easier. Temperance was obsessed with what mountain people called the sight. She had an uncanny ability to accurately predict weather patterns, deaths, and other important events, which both impressed and scared her neighbors. She would show up at cabins hours before work started, bringing supplies as if she had known help would be needed. Families started planning their seasonal activities around her forecasts because they were so accurate about harsh winters or early springs. By the winter of 1854, the twins were essential to the mountain communities that were spread out. Their reputation spread through the family ties that connected the isolated settlements. But even as thankful families praised their life-saving actions, small signs began to appear that hinted at something darker behind their kind facade. Neighbors started to see strange lights coming from the hollow on nights when there was no moon. They flickered through the trees like signals or ritual fires. The twins wanted to be paid not in money or regular goods, but in strange things like iron nails, coarse salt, and red thread. Older residents thought these were strange because they were things that their grandparents had brought from Scotland and Ireland and used in folk magic. What bothered me the most was that the sisters were very interested in unmarried men who came through the area. They asked them a lot of questions about their families and physical traits in ways that seemed to go beyond normal curiosity about strangers. When two-year-old Declan Murphy didn't come back from bringing grain to the Blackwood cabin in October 1856, his father, Silas, had to deal with a nightmare that would show how bad law enforcement was on the frontier and how deadly it could be for people to stay quiet. Sheriff Josiah Crawford, who had been a scout in the Union Army and was now the county sheriff, was faced with an investigation that would put to the test all the skills he had learned during the Mexican-American War. He had a huge job ahead of him, looking into disappearances over hundreds of square miles of wilderness with only 2 deputies, no modern communication systems, and communities that were very wary of outside authority. Crawford's first look at the situation showed him that his job was impossible. The Blackwood cabin was in a gray area between counties where the boundaries were not clear and had never been properly surveyed or legally established. His office had never officially heard about any missing persons cases before because mountain families preferred to deal with these things through their own informal networks instead of what they called government men. Nearest telegraph lines ended in Springfield, which was 40 miles away, so it took days instead of hours to talk to other law enforcement agencies. In the Ozarks, which are humid and full of wildlife, physical evidence quickly disappeared because of scavengers and the weather. Within weeks, they could get rid of any signs of human activity. The sheriff's methodical approach started with talking to families in the mountains who had known the Blackwood sisters for the 13 years they lived there. He found a wall of carefully crafted answers that praised the twins' healing abilities but didn't talk directly about the men who had gone missing. Every family gave the same stories about successful births and illnesses that got better. But when Crawford asked about male visitors to the cabin, the conversation stopped right away. A few women made vague comments about old mountain ways and things best left buried. But they wouldn't say more, even when Crawford told them how serious his investigation was. Crawford's discovery of a disturbing pattern in the timing of the twins' disappearances was the key to understanding how they worked. Every missing man had disappeared during certain phases of the moon, which local residents carefully called the twins' ritual seasons. These seasons happened about once every 3 months and were marked by the sisters taking a break from their regular medical practice and telling any male visitors during these times to come to the cabin alone, without any witnesses or companions. After a lot of work, Crawford finally got important testimony when one 9-year-old Benjamin Thorne admitted to going to the cabin in September 1856 to get help with breathing problems that were making it hard for him to work during harvest season. Thorne's story showed how scary it was inside the cabin during the twins' ritual times. He said that when he got there, the inside had changed from the familiar medical workspace that neighbors had told him about into something that looked like a ceremonial chamber. Ropes hung from the rafters, herbs were arranged in circles on the floor, and what looked like human bones were hanging around the room like decorations. The young man's strong body kept him from feeling the effects of a herbal preparation that the twins had tried to give him. This gave him the clarity to see how dangerous his situation was and run away before they could finish whatever ritual they had planned. His description gave Crawford the first clear proof that the disappearances were not random acts of violence, but part of a long-running pattern that had been going on for years without anyone speaking up. Crawford's investigation got more intense when he put together search parties to look through the cave systems that honeycomb the limestone bluffs around Devil's Den Hollow. Searchers found a stash of personal items hidden in a cave half a mile from the cabin. This confirmed their worst fears about what had happened to the missing men. The dry cave environment kept Marcus Webb's unique silver cross, Tobias Fletcher's leather merchant goods, and, most importantly, clothing and personal items from at least 10 different men over the course of more than a decade. Sheriff Crawford looked more closely into the Blackwood twins' past and found a disturbing story that explained the twisted beliefs that led them to commit crimes over and over again. Crawford put together the sisters' history by carefully asking older mountain residents who had known them longer. The twins' grandmother on their father's side raised them in eastern Kentucky after their parents died of cholera when they were 8 years old. This grandmother, who was known as a granny woman in the area, had taught them a dangerous mix of Scottish Highland folk magic and Cherokee spiritual practices that she had learned during the forced removal period of the 1,830 seconds. Crawford learned through interviews with Kentuckians who remembered the family that the grandmother taught that some bloodlines had ancient supernatural power that could only be kept alive through ritualized conception during sacred lunar phases. This twisted spiritual framework says that children born from these ceremonies would get powers that would help keep the balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. The grandmother had convinced the young twins that they were among the few people who could stop the complete loss of these ancient powers as traditional mountain culture gave way to modern civilization. Crawford's investigation showed that the twins had a methodical way of picking their victims. He figured out that Mercy and Temperance chose possible victims based on certain physical traits they thought showed they were old blood carriers, like red hair, being left-handed, having unique birthmarks, and having unusual eye colors. He did this by listening to survivors' stories and looking at the personal items found in the cave. Their grandmother taught them that these traits were common among men whose bloodlines went back to the ancient Celtic and Native American peoples who had once had supernatural powers. As Crawford spoke with more people in the community, who finally spoke up, the twins' methods became clearer. The sisters would trick men into coming to their cabin by pretending to be sick and saying they had cures for their chronic problems, or that they would look at strange symptoms. Once the victims were alone in the cabin, they were given strong herbal mixtures that made them compliant but still able to be aware enough to take part in the ritual conception process. The drugs, which came from plants that the twins grew in secret gardens, put people in a dreamlike state that made them forget what had happened and unable to give clear accounts of their experiences. The most terrifying part of Crawford's investigation came when he found out that the twins had succeeded in their evil plan. When local birth records were compared to the times when babies went missing, it was found that there were several unexplained deaths of infants that were linked to different natural causes, but happened in a way that suggested systematic infanticide. The twins had apparently killed children who didn't show the supernatural powers they were looking for. They didn't see these deaths as killing innocent people, but as getting rid of failed experiments. Crawford's interviews with several married mountain men showed the full extent of the twins' actions and the psychological terror they had caused in the community for more than 10 years. These men, speaking in private and with clear shame, talked about memory gaps that they couldn't explain after going to the cabin for medical reasons. They told of terrible dreams that had details too specific and disturbing to be dismissed as simple nightmares, feelings of being restrained, the taste of bitter herbs, and broken memories of doing things they would never have agreed to do if they had been fully aware of what they were doing. The investigation took a terrible turn when Crawford found a hidden root cellar under the main building while searching the cabin grounds. Searchers found Declan Murphy's body in this underground chamber. It showed signs of being held captive for a long time and being abused on a regular basis. The young man's body had signs of being restrained, being malnourished from being held for weeks, and being exposed to the same herbal compounds that were found all over the cabin. The most disturbing parts of his death were the ritualistic parts that showed the twins were getting ready for a final ceremony when they had to kill their victim too soon. There were also more signs of the twins' increasing violence in the root cellar. These included bone fragments from several victims, ritual tools made from human remains, and detailed records of their activities, written in Mercy's precise handwriting that showed years of systematic abuse with the coldness of scientific observation. When Sheriff Crawford told Silas, Declan Murphy's father, the terrible news about his son's death, the Irish immigrant's world fell apart in ways that went beyond just being sad. Finding his son's tortured body and learning that neighbors had kept quiet about the twins' bad reputation turned Silas from an outsider who was on the fringes of society into a man who was pushed to the edge of reason. The five-year-old farmer was so angry after Crawford carefully explained the evidence found in the root cellar, the weeks of captivity, the systematic abuse, and the ritualistic elements surrounding Declan's death, that no legal process could satisfy him. Crawford was in a tough spot as he tried to build a case against the twins through the right legal channels. Even though there was a lot of physical evidence, and more people from the community were coming forward to testify, the sheriff faced problems at every turn. No trustworthy witnesses were willing to testify in public against the twins because they were afraid of supernatural punishment and being shunned by neighbors who preferred to keep mountain problems to themselves. Because of the complicated jurisdictional issues between counties, any trial would take a long time and have a lot of procedural problems that could let the twins get away with their crimes. The twins were starting to make vague threats about telling embarrassing secrets about well-known people in the community who had been drugged and abused in their rituals, which was the most troubling thing. Several well-known mountain men, such as a local judge, and the region's most successful merchant, were scared that their victimization would be revealed in public testimony. This made it more likely that the case would be dropped instead of going through the courts. Crawford's network of informants told him that the twins were going to finish the ritual cycle with one last ceremony on the 21st of December, 1856, the winter solstice, which their sick belief system saw as the most holy night of the year. This was when things got really bad. Their target was the 6-year-old son of the local mill owner. His red hair and prominent family position made him a perfect target, and his disappearance could never be explained away by the usual excuses. Silas Murphy, who was looking into his son's death in a desperate way, found out about the twins' plans. He then made the decision that would lead to the case's violent end. On December 21, the Irish immigrant walked up to the Blackwood cabin with his military-issued rifle from his time in the Mexican-American War. It was the longest night of the year over the Ozark Mountains. His plan was simple and set in stone: keep another family from going through what his own had gone through. The fight happened very quickly in the flickering candlelight of the cabin's main room. Murphy found the twins in the middle of their ritual preparations. The mill owner's son was already drugged and tied up, just like they had done before. Temperance was putting herbs in the circle patterns that marked their ceremonial space, and Mercy was looking at the detailed journal where she wrote down the spiritual meaning of each part of the ritual. Neither sister seemed to know that what they were doing was against the law. They were sure until the end that they were doing something good for their souls. Murphy's gunfire killed both twins right away, ending their 13-year reign of terror before they could finish their last ritual. The mill owner's son, who was found alive but heavily drugged, would later give important testimony about how the twins were feeling in their last hours. Even though they were about to die, they still believed that what they were doing was God's will. They saw their victims not as people who deserved dignity in life, but as necessary parts of keeping ancient supernatural powers alive. Crawford got to the cabin a few hours after the murders. It was too late to stop Murphy's vigilante justice, but it was in time to take pictures of the scene that would prove the twins' crimes beyond a doubt. The sheriff found ritual tools spread out around the cabin, dozens of personal items belonging to victims over a 10-year period, and most importantly, Mercy's detailed journal that documented their activities with clinical accuracy and showed the full extent of their systematic abuse. The trial of Silas Murphy for the murder of the Blackwood twins began in the spring of 1857. What should have been a simple case of vigilante justice turned into something much more complicated as more and more evidence and testimony came to light about the twins' crimes. The Irish immigrant who had been on the fringes of mountain society and suspected of being a criminal for almost 10 years suddenly became a protector of the community. Neighbors who had previously avoided his family now offered support and character testimony on his behalf. The prosecutor only pursued manslaughter charges instead of murder because there was so much evidence of the twins' systematic crimes, and the community supported Murphy's actions. He recognized that the circumstances that led a grieving father to take justice into his own hands were very unusual. The twins' journal, which was read aloud during Murphy's trial, was the most terrifying proof of their 13-year reign of terror. Mercy's careful handwriting recorded the deaths of at least 12 men between 1,843 and 1,856, along with detailed accounts of how she chose her victims, how she prepared for the rituals, and how she clinically observed the last hours of her victims. The twins' journal entries showed that they had no remorse or understanding that what they were doing was illegal. They thought that hurting people was necessary to protect what they thought were ancient supernatural powers. There were reports of multiple pregnancies and the systematic killing of babies who didn't show the twins the skills they expected. This was written about in the same detached way that people talk about the weather or changes in the seasons. Sheriff Crawford used the case as a reason to set up better ways for isolated mountain communities and territorial law enforcement to talk to each other. The investigation showed that there were dangerous holes in the way missing persons cases were handled, and that confusion about who had jurisdiction in rural crime cases could lead to death. Crawford's thorough documentation of the Blackwood case served as the basis for Missouri's territorial government efforts to improve reporting systems for missing persons and set examples for how to work together across county lines when crimes happen. Murphy was sentenced to 5 years in prison for manslaughter, but he was released early after serving only 18 months because of community pressure and the fact that he had helped protect future victims. When the man who had once been an unwelcome outsider came back to the mountain community, he was welcomed as a respected member of the society that had initially rejected him. He spent the rest of his life farming peacefully in the same area where his son had been killed. He died of natural causes in 1871, and his neighbors were grateful that his desperate act had saved lives. After the twins died, people in the community set fire to the Blackwood cabin, which burned down to the ground. People from miles away could see the flames as mountain families gathered to watch the building that had housed so much evil burn down. Locally, Devil's Den Hollow became known as Dead Women's Den. Travelers stayed away from the cursed place, which was marked by slowly disappearing cairns that warned them away. Nature slowly took back the site, with plants growing over the burned foundations and wild animals coming back to areas they had seemed to avoid while the twins were there. People in the community who stayed quiet about what the twins were doing had lasting psychological effects that affected many families for generations. Several families moved away from the area completely because they couldn't deal with knowing about the twins' crimes and not doing anything about them sooner. Some people felt very guilty about not doing anything, especially those who thought something was wrong but chose to keep the peace in the community instead of being brave. The case became a warning story that mountain families told each other about how dangerous it is to let evil go unchecked when people are alone, and how deadly it is to choose silence over justice. The last chapter of the story took place in 1885, when a railroad survey team working in the area found the overgrown cabin ruins again and found more human remains. This led to a short investigation. One of the twins' later victims wrote a final letter that was found during this excavation. In it, he talks about how he was starting to understand their true nature and how he tried to escape their underground prison but failed. This letter, which is still kept in county records, was the last piece of documentary evidence that showed the full extent of the horror that took place in Devil's Den Hollow. It made sure that the victims' suffering would be remembered and that the twins' crimes would serve as a permanent warning about how evil can grow when people are alone.